In today's episode, I had a conversation with Professor Moshe Bar, who is a cognitive neuroscientist and one of the co-founders of a company called Hedonia. Gotta love that name, right? Hedonia is dedicated to bringing accessible mental health tools to people, mostly to help with depression and anxiety, and to give people additional options who might have difficulties with things like insurance coverage or transportation, or who in some way, shape, or form might either have difficulty accessing other treatments or benefit from having additional treatments on top of things like therapy and medication. I had some technical difficulties at the beginning of my discussion with Professor Barr. And as I was trying to problem solve those difficulties, we were also just chatting. And everything happened to start working as he was in the middle of explaining something to me. And he was kind of already in his zone at this point. So rather than like starting the whole conversation over, I just let him go and we just kind of picked it up from there. So the reason I'm telling you all this is once the interview portion of this starts, you're going to feel like you've been dropped into a conversation between two people with no backstory and no context, because that's exactly what is going to be happening. So I just want to take a moment to introduce him and tell you a little bit about why I was speaking with him. I really hope you enjoy this conversation. And if the treatments and strategies he's talking about sound interesting to you, I would definitely recommend you check out Hedonia's main product, which is the mobile app Mood Bloom.
I'm really impressed by all your channels and the knowledge and your demeanor and the way you deliver it. It's very authoritative but friendly and warm. Really
Thank you.
good
I really
service to
appreciate
your
that.
audience. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, as you, I'm sure know, I'm a big fan of what you're doing too. The crossover between mental health and, I mean, technology in general, but gaming specifically is something I've been really interested in for a long time, but I personally don't have the skills to execute any of my ideas. So I'm really glad that there are people like you out there who are actually able to bridge that gap. I think it's something we need so much in our field because I think we get really, I won't rant about this too much because I know we have a lot to talk about today, but I think we get so narrow-minded with what treatment has to look like. And there's so many limitations to, sitting down in an office for an hour, for example, whether that's logistics, finances, transportation, accessibility is a huge barrier in mental health. And
Right.
so, the fact that you guys were able to figure out, we have this concept, FTP, how can we take this concept and make it available to as many people as possible is that's the kind of thinking we need in mental health.
Mhm.
So I'm so appreciative of the work that you guys are doing and
Yeah,
and the
thanks.
ideas you're
Thanks.
executing. Yeah. I'm curious where, I know you've been doing your research and your work on FTP for quite some time.
Right.
And the idea of combining it with a gaming app, that's a newer development, right?
Exactly.
That wasn't always the plan, right?
Actually, almost the opposite, because I used to be a professor at Harvard, and back then, most of these ideas were developed when I was doing my research there. And I remember their commercialization office was really trying to convince me to make a company out of it, to make an IP. And I was an academic snob, like take my papers, I'm busy doing other interesting experiments. And I still remember, it connects with your previous comment. I still remember a conversation I had with my director, who was a very smart guy, still is a very smart guy, who was telling me, you're developing these ideas. You want to help patients. You need to get it out there. If it's limited to the lab, nobody gets the benefit. So you should step down from your pedestal and roll up your sleeves like I did here and let's get it out there. But it did take some time for me. When I moved back to Israel, I immediately assumed a position of being a director of a big neuroscience center, so I didn't have time to deal with it. But as soon as I stepped down as a director, as luck had it, I connected with Samuel, who was just out of Waze, one of the founders of Waze, and he came with the right energy and the right spirit, and I was with the right state of mind. And to be honest, I think back then, maybe 15 years ago, when I was still at Harvard, the world of gaming was less developed in that orientation of
Sure.
helping people, period. And I think also the audience would have been less receptive back then to games that are that's supposed to cure. I think many people are, more open to it now, way more people. Yeah.
Mhm. Absolutely. What you said about, I'm paraphrasing what you said, I guess, but like bridging the gap between academia and practical applications is something I think we really need to be working on because there's so much incredible research being done about the brain and about neurochemistry and about cognitive functioning. And the science is so compelling, but then we get stuck in figuring out, okay, we know these things about the brain, we know these things about mental health, but how do we put this in someone's life? How do we make this into a thing that people can use to actually improve their mental health or improve their quality of life? And
Right.
that practical applicability piece, I think, is where so like myself included at times, where so many people I think get stuck or get hung up on like, how do we make this meaningful to the people out there who need access to this information? And that's in a different way. That's what I try to do with my channel and the podcast is take some of these ideas, some of the things I've learned along the way, and make it, whether it's through a metaphor or a routine, make this idea into something that people can use to improve their lives. So I think we're very aligned on that and trying to achieve similar goals through different modalities.
Right. Right. And it solves a lot of issues. I mean, making it accessible through your mobile phone, of course, it helps you use nuggets of time here and there, little pieces here and there that you're waiting for the kids or waiting for the bus or whatever, or waiting for your
Yeah,
coffee. But also you think about all these people that cannot reach treatment. Either they're not aware or they live in remote areas where it's not as accessible, where they don't have the means. Maybe they worry about stigma that unfortunately still exists. So this really solves all of this in one shot, just like have it in your palm. And yeah,
it's so yeah. So the idea behind the Mood Bloom app, right? You mentioned time frame. This is a game that's meant to be played and can achieve like significant results in shorter time frames, right? Like I think I remember seeing, kind of 15-minute increments is a really good goal to aim for. And this isn't
right.
something that requires as much of a, in the moment long opening in your schedule as like a therapy session might, for example. Is that about right? 15 minutes or so?
Yeah. It's about 15 minutes. I mean, I'm just going to tell you something technical here, but still important. It shouldn't be confused with, because the game has what we call, I learned all this terminology now, a meta game. There's a whole farm there. You can spend hours just with the farm. So this is not the
Right.
idea. This is just the wrapping that should be more amusing. But there are what we call TGs, the therapeutic games, currently 5, but we're constantly working on more. So you need to be spending 15 minutes over, playing with these TGs. So it is in a way translated into stages in the games. But yes, it doesn't amount. People in our clinical trials, which we will probably talk about later, were playing only 15 minutes, only on the TGs. There was no farm over there, and this was perfect. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I definitely want to talk a little bit about kind of the methodology and the rationale behind the TGs and give everybody listening a little bit more insight into like how these things might help them, because at first when you play Mood Bloom, it doesn't automatically look different than other similar games, right? Like other farming or city building games. And I know that
Right.
that's by design. Like it's meant to feel like a game
Right.
and not meant to feel like, oh, I'm doing a clinical exercise right now. And it has this, fun little, like you called it, the wrapper, the farming simulator. Um,
Right.
but I do think it'd be helpful to dig into a little more, like what do these TGs do, to the brain, to cognitive performance?
Do you mind if
Yeah,
I give you the background of how I reached FTP? Because this kind of
yeah,
sets the stage for the whole, it's like an overarching theme that
absolutely. Let's
then
start there.
everything falls into place.
Yeah,
So I started as what's called doing basic science. I didn't care about anything clinical. I mean, I cared about it personally, but I didn't care about it in research-wise. Just understanding how the brain works. I didn't want to be applicable. I didn't want to produce any product. I didn't want to cure anybody. I was just, let's understand how the brain works. And within neuroscience, I'm considered a cognitive neuroscientist. Okay, so it's the mixture of cognitive psychology and neuroscience. And one time I came across a little paragraph in some general psychological bulletin saying that people in depression do not take context into account, the global context into account. And I was, wait a minute, I was there at Harvard Medical School when they just invented what's called fMRI, the functional MRI, this possibility of seeing activity in the brain. And my lab was the first one to define what in the brain, what network in the brain is responsible for understanding and representing context. So the scientist in me is like, how is context related to mood? What is the relationship? So I couldn't ignore it. Once this itch starts, then you cannot just let it go. So it's like I have to explain how me, Mr. Context, seeing the connection to mood. So then I started thinking about, wait, there's a whole population here that suffers from mental disorders, and they think differently. So how differently, and what characterizes the mind and the thought pattern of somebody with a mood disorder specifically? And you probably know all mental disorders are accompanied by some sort of a mood disorder. It's not only depression. I mean, depression is the flagship, and anxiety, but addiction, PTSD, everything that you can think of can actually also has a mood disorder in it. Mm-hmm. So I started to hone in on the way they think differently. We think differently when we suffer from depression and anxiety. I didn't care about the molecules. I didn't care about chemical imbalance. I didn't care about the content of what they think about. Obviously, it's a negative content, but I said, let's put everything aside. Thoughts are transitioning. There's a giant network in our brain we call it semantic network, of everything we know, everything we learn, everything we wish, everything we fear, everything we experience. It's a giant network, and you can walk on this network. When you think, you go step by step between these nodes. So how do they advance on this network differently than people without depression? And very quickly I learned, mostly from the literature, that hasn't been combined under one overarching theme, which is the FTP now. I learned that there are at least three main characteristics, and they're debilitating. They sound inane and innocent, but they're debilitating. One of them is ruminative thoughts. Just as you know, right? Ruminations, you're stuck and you go over the same topic over and over in circles. Everybody knows this. Second thing is repetitive thoughts. You keep repeating, you don't go anywhere else. And the third one is that the thought process is slower. So in many respects, just like the physical demeanor, also the inner mental demeanor is the same. It's lethargic. It doesn't move fast. It doesn't move far. It likes to stay where it is. So we can really see the analogy between the physical and the mental. And I love this comparison. And some projects in my lab actually focus exactly on this parallel between. Okay, so now the next step for my lab was, now that we know how they think differently, let's try to undo this thinking. If people think narrowly and they're stuck on the same nodes on this giant network, let's undo this. Let's make them think more associatively and more broadly, and go away from this focus of rumination. So we did this very, very in a very simple manner, and throughout everything I'll explain will be very simple. And I used to be embarrassed when we talk with investors or possible partners. They saw this Harvard professor, they expected a lot of formulas and molecules and whatever. And I'm explaining something. And then I realized that the simplicity is the power here. It's really the strength, because I can confuse you with terminology. It's not going to help you. But this is just the simplicity is what makes it, I think, most elegant. So in the first experiment, I really need to coerce my postdoc, my research associate in the lab, to do this experiment. Now she's a professor in Columbia University, but back then it just seemed so far-fetched. And I told her, they ruminate. They stay with this. Let's just make them think more associatively. And how would we do this? We'll show them lists of words that rather that stay within the same, and I'll give an example, rather than stay within the same topic, emulating rumination, let them advance. So let me give you an example. I can give you a chain of words that will be like this: table, chair, tablecloth, utensils, dish, dinner, glass of wine, guess, right? So nothing here is emotional, nothing here is negative or positive. It's all neutral, but still it stays on the same topic. Or you can start with table and then say wood, and then say forest, and then they say bear, and then say Winnie the Pooh, and then say honey, right? So you kind of advance broadly and you go away from the center of where you started. So this already showed with healthy individuals, people without depression, and I don't really like to call it healthy or unhealthy, but we're all unhealthy in some way. But yes, but to kind of change this pattern of thought, the idea was, let's see, we took people without depression and we had them read this list of words, either expanding associatively and broadly or staying within the same topic, again, emotionally neutral. And we found significant improvement in mood just by them reading like 20 lists of words. We measured their mood before and after, and we found significant improvement in mood just by reading lists of words. And this was, of course, published in a good journal and so on and so on. And since then, we've followed up on this, and other labs have followed up on this. And this was, again, with people without depression. Now, 15 years later, we have this in a game. And this is exactly the game you were asking about, the chains. And we had to think about how would this be gamified? Because when I met game designers for the first time, and I told them, this is the experiment you need to do in the computer, in the phone, they said, this is not fun. It's not a game. It's boring. It's a test. So they had to make it into a farm and into steps and blocks that move. So their idea is to add the sugar and the enticement. But it's basically the same idea of you're provided with lists of words. We don't do the narrow because we don't want to compare ruminations. People who come to our game already ruminate enough. They know how debilitating it could be. So the idea was, let's expand the way they think by having them play with this list of words that expand broadly and broadly. So that's the idea behind chains, for example. Yeah.
Yeah. Your description of the ruminative thought patterns that follow depression or any mood disorder or mood symptoms in particular, I mean, it's so descriptive of my own experiences with depression. In my book, I described it as kind of like sort of like you wake up every day in this forest, right? And you could theoretically go in any direction, right? You're in this dense forest and you have 365 degrees of freedom around you. So there's nearly infinite options. But if, as you're looking around in this dense forest and you're confused and you're scared and you don't know where to go, and you see that there's a trail in the forest, well, that's probably the direction you're going to go in, right? And mentally, that trail would represent your thought patterns or your thought habits, because the brain, of course, is very habitual and has a tendency to do what it has been doing, hence rumination.
Exactly. Yeah.
So you wake up every day, you see this pattern, or I'm sorry, this pathway. And you say, well, that looks like the easiest pathway to travel, so I'm going to travel that path. You travel that path, and it ends in a swamp that kind of sucks you down. And you say, well, that was terrible. I hope I don't end up in the swamp again. And the next morning, you wake up in the same forest, and the same pathway is there, and you end up on the path again, saying, oh, I hope this path doesn't lead to the swamp this time. Well, the path always leads to the swamp, because that's what ruminative thought patterns do to us, is they keep us locked into this linear way of living and thinking and feeling and existing, when in fact there's a theoretically infinite range of options out there. But it's so hard for us to break out of those thought patterns because we're such creatures of habit, and we have this natural drive for homeostasis, right? And what we're most driven to do is what is most familiar to us. And
yeah, and there is an explanation for this also at the neuronal level. Exactly the forest example that you gave, there is a phenomenon called priming. So if you tried a certain path in your cortex, it's easier to walk on it, figuratively. So it's just less resistance. So it's easier for you to just go to what you already know, what you already been through, because just least resistance, so to speak. So by playing every day, or by practicing these methods every day, you carve new paths. You kind of make new paths that will be as easy for you and become, as you said, your new mental habits.
And something else that I've talked a lot about on my channel that I know people have been really interested in is the idea of mood congruent memory, which is somewhat parallel to rumination, which is that when you're in a certain mood state, the memories from your past that tend to be most accessible to you because of these neural networks that you're describing are the memories that are kind of coded with a similar emotional affect. So when you're feeling
Right.
hopeless, for example, your brain is primed to recall and bring to your working memory memories of other times in your life when you have felt hopeless, which then in that moment makes it feel like hopelessness is just your eternal state of being and it's what always has been. And then we project
Exactly.
it into the future and think that's what always will be. And life just feels like an endless string of hopelessness or anger or anxiety or, whatever the emotional state you're in is at the time. So just anecdotally to my own experiences, the rationale behind FTP and the way you've gamified it just it makes so much sense to me, as it relates to my personal walk with depression.
Yeah. And FTP, we have to, I don't know if your listeners know this, but FTP stands for facilitating thought progression. So the whole idea was to let's just unclog thinking, make it broader, make it more original, less repetitive. Let's make it faster. Let's make it more global, right? So if you see the forest, and here the forest comes again, seems to be
Yeah.
the theme. So see the forest rather than the trees. Take and I have to add that. When I speak to other psychologists and psychiatrists, they see a lot of similarities to things that they've been doing. Even the famous CBT, right, the cognitive behavioral therapy, they do encourage their patients to look at things more globally, just as we do with this game, Zoom Out, right? So it's the same idea. There's overlap with other methods that actually is very encouraging. Yeah.
If you wouldn't mind, let's talk a little bit more about the zoom out game too, and how that can benefit a person's like cognitive patterns, because that's a game I find really interesting too in terms of how it helps facilitate global thinking, right? Could you speak a little
Yeah.
more about that?
Right. So again, by way of facilitating the advancement, the progression of your thought, the idea is that rather than having you stick with the details, making you take a step back and look at the whole, the big picture. Just like the emotional memory that you mentioned before, if you take a step back, you realize there are other moods that you experience, there are other associations, and you can put things in proportion, so in perspective. So zoom out is the idea that encourages. So when we look, all of us, when we look at the picture, we can see the little details and we can see the global picture. And
Yeah.
obviously, at the end, we see all of them. But the question is, what do we focus on? And it's been shown not only by me, and I'm very happy to say that many of what we do, many of the things we do are also a result of other labs. It's not some secret method that I developed in some underground lab. I'm very proud and happy to say that my good colleagues also replicated, expanded, and innovated things that we feel comfortable borrowing so that it kind of fills in the whole thing.
Mhm.
So if you take this specific task of looking at big letters made out of smaller letters, let's say a big F made out of little A's.
Yeah.
So if I ask somebody, what letter do you see there? Give me one letter. People in depression and anxiety also would tend to say A, would tend to see the little letters. And people without depression or in a better mood tend to see the big F, right? And the idea is, how do we again help you acquire or reacquire? Because all of us are born with these habits, but then they get washed out as we develop depression symptoms. So how can we make you reacquire this mental habit of seeing the big picture, right? And I have to share with you another observation that I was excited to learn about in my career. That is, many things that happen in one resolution in the brain are also applicable in others. So if I teach you to look globally at letters or small lines, this will also help you see, the higher level, the social situations also at bigger level. Rather, I don't need to teach you every domain of the brain to think globally. If I make you more global in small letters, you'll also be global with your friends. And that I think is very cool, that you don't have to work in all levels, but rather they're reflected and disseminated and reflected in all other levels of processing.
The zooming out is one that makes so much intuitive sense to me. And I actually, so okay, I need to give a little disclaimer to what I'm about to say. I have a little bit of a habit of thinking that I have invented things only to find out later that I'm not the originator of that idea. So, with that disclaimer in mind, I was working on a therapeutic process called zooming out, which was similar, but honestly a little more obscure and harder to implement. But the idea was kind of like a scene in a movie. You know, there's a lot of scenes in movies where you start looking at something like a cup of coffee or something, right? And then the camera slowly pans back and you gather more context about the situation and what's happening. And like with each layer that the camera pans back, you often develop a different perspective of what is happening in this scene. And so the broader the width of information you can perceive, the more information, the more accurate information you have about what's actually happening in this context. And I've observed that so many people with depression in particular, I think, well, and anxiety too, um, live in such a zoomed in way where there's some, whatever the least satisfactory or most upsetting part of their life is, it's like their minds become very locked in on that. And I've experienced that too, where it's like on some level, I logically know that there is more to my life than this thing, but it is really all I can think about right now and all that I can draw from emotionally is this part of my life that I'm very upset about or that is the least satisfactory to me. And so I love that you guys have been able to I think create a more practical way of just practicing that
Yeah.
act of just mentally zooming out and just gaining, more perspective or more context for what's actually
Yeah,
happening.
I think we can all resonate, and I love your personal example, and I can share my own personal example just from recently. So a month ago, I moved to a cool area here in Tel Aviv, and I was stressed out by so many details. I was bummed. I was really not happy.
Yeah.
And then I had to fly to Milan. So last week I was in Italy for a week, and of course, Italy makes everybody more cheerful, no matter what. But but suddenly, all these things that were my entire world and my entire source of stress and agony seemed so minuscule. It's funny how, no, it's interesting, funny in an interesting way, how you just have to step back, 2 steps, and suddenly it's like, why was I really worrying about this, bill or whatever? Yeah.
My own version of the Italy story. I don't know why. This is just one that's always come to mind for me. It was such a weird moment for me. Is I had made like a 15-second video of my daughter swinging on swing set in the backyard. And I don't remember exactly what was going on that day. I just know I was really stressed out. I just had a lot on my mind, but I was having to look up, see her swinging. I'm like, oh, this is a nice moment. I should capture it. And I recorded it. It was like a 15-second video, posted it on Facebook. And then the next day I watched the video. And I remember thinking, if someone else had posted this video, it was just this perfect moment. It was a beautiful day, and there's all these trees in the background. You could hear these birds singing. And I remember thinking, if I saw this video on someone else's social media feed,
You
I would
wouldn't
think,
connect it much.
man, that person has such a good life. This just looks wonderful. But I was
Right.
there for that moment. And I remember like this did not feel the way I would think it felt looking, from the outside looking in, because I was zoomed in. I don't know if it was like
Excellent.
work stress or money, or maybe my house was falling. I don't know what was happening, but
Excellent, excellent,
yeah.
excellent story. Yeah.
How about the clouds mini game? Could you talk a little bit more about, the methodology
Yeah.
behind that and what
So
that does for us?
Yeah, so clouds is really to stretch your imagination slash your creativity. So that's another interesting aspect that,
Yeah.
I mean, there is this, I call it a myth that artists, creative artists are all depressed. I don't believe
Yeah,
this myth, and I'm
sure.
here to debunk it in many respects. And I can give you a long explanation. I gave a talk and I talked about this also in Milan. But the idea here is actually the opposite, that people in good mood are more creative, and we tap on this with all our games, that the relationships are reciprocal. So even with a zoom out, if you think globally, you're in better mood. If you're in better mood, you think more globally. So also with creativity, if you're more creative now, and creativity can swing along there. This relates to something else that we published about states of mind. So when you're in a state of your increased creativity, you're also in better mood. And if I improve your mood, I can improve your creativity. But that's beautiful. If you're lacking a mood, I'll improve your creativity. If you're lacking creativity, I'll improve your mood. And these kind of pull each other together. So the idea with clouds, we all experienced this, and initially we thought it's a farm. We'll have a farmer, lying underneath a tree and looking at the sky, but it was too complicated graphically, so we just had it as an isolated game. But the idea here is really to stretch your imagination and have you see things beyond what's provided to you. So it's not a cloud; it's rather a fork or an octopus. And actually, it fires back at us in a good way, because people start complaining also on the like with the feedback that we get in the community, or maybe even in the App Store, that they say, "Oh, I found something else that you did not provide as an option. I was even more creative," right? So it starts to be like a little, and it is based on we kind of ask a large group of people, "What do you see here?" And we take the most common responses. But yes, the idea here is to be playful and creative in looking at everyday shapes and seeing other things. And sometimes you have to rotate, so it really kind of stretches what you see.
Yeah. It's funny that you brought up reviews in the App Store, because I've noticed a couple. So I'm kind of protective of you guys, because I love what you're
Thank you.
doing and the forward thinking and the accessibility. And I've seen a
Yeah.
couple people who have been a little critical of the clouds TG, and specifically, the game has, the built-in correct or incorrect answers, right? And I've seen a couple people who get, I think, kind of irritated or offended if the game tells them like, no, that was in this cloud.
Huh?
And my first thought when I saw that is, it's important to remember, like, what's the purpose of playing these games. And it's not, I'm not trying to be, I'm not, well, I am trying to be a little bit funny here, but like, it's not about trying to become a cloud master, right? Like the purpose of playing the game is, it's an internal goal, right? It's
Right.
to improve your mood state, to improve your thought processes. And so,
Mhm.
if the game says no, that's not, that's not correct, don't worry about it. It's not going to harm you.
It
The
might,
game
it
is very
might,
generous with
yeah.
giving you the resources you need to build your farm. So,
Right. We may be able to rectify this by just giving different wording of the purpose, as you said. And the idea kind of, we try to convey it, but we'll try to have to hammer it in that it is based on questionnaires of large groups. And if you
right.
came up with something else, good for you. But out of these two
Yeah.
options, which one is
Yeah.
the one you see? Yeah.
Right. Well, I just think it's good to remember, like, don't turn the game into a performance task, because I another area of research that I'm really interested in is what makes an effective coping technique for like distraction or downtime. And the literature that I've seen, it reviews three essential components: that it's high stimulation, right? So it has to be something that is interesting or engaging to your mind. It has to be something that kind of makes you think a little bit. So, like some of the more, this is gonna sound harsh, but like more mindless games where you don't really have to pay attention or focus aren't
Right.
necessarily going to be as effective at distracting you from depressed or anxious thoughts, for example. Because if you can just play this game completely on autopilot, you can still ruminate, and therefore it's counterproductive, right? But then
Right.
the second is that it's low stress, and that somewhat depends on the individual. So if you get caught up, and like, I don't mean to say this
I see what
dismissively,
you're
because
saying.
yeah,
Uh,
I know these things are these types of thinking. I get that this is very common with depression and anxiety, and I've experienced it too. But like, if you get really perfectionistic while you're playing a game, and you turn it into a performance situation where you're like, I have to get 100%, or I have to get the maximum amount of resources or whatever. Well, now you're making it into a high stress task. You're making it into a performance
Excellent point.
situation, and then it's not going to be as beneficial as it could be in helping you
Right.
with your mood. I do the same thing with, like, one of my favorite downtime activities, just as kind of an aside, is like, I like to do woodworking. I'm not actually good at woodworking, but that's kind of the point. Is like, if I got really good at it, I'd feel like, "Ooh, I got to make something really good so I can go sell it on Etsy or something like that." And the fact is, every single thing I make with woodworking ends up as firewood, and that's fine. That's okay. It's not a performance task. That I do it not to because I want to create some external object. I do it because it helps me improve my mood, and that is the purpose. And I know when we're
Yeah, I
struggling
can
with,
completely connect
yeah,
with it. But when we were living in the US, I built my kids a big tree house. It was a
yeah,
giant tree house, and I'm sure worse than you are in woodworking. And
I don't
I
know.
I mention this tree house sometimes in talks because it's a proof that a collection of crooked beams can together become a stable, a stable structure. But now we all have tattoos of this treehouse on our legs because
Oh,
we like
really?
to.
That's so cool.
Yeah, yeah.
I want to talk a little about the other two games too. We haven't talked about Speed Read or Two Belong yet. Could we talk a little bit
Right.
about Speed Read and the science behind that?
Yeah, sure. So speed read connects to what I said before about people in depression thinking more slowly, just like people in depression tend to move also. And it has been shown by a good friend of mine from Harvard Psychology, who unfortunately passed away a few years ago, very creative person, and his postdoc that showed that when you make people read fast and increasingly faster and faster, it improves their mood. And two interesting aspects about this. One of them is that in a way, it imitates the exhilaration that sometimes people report in mania, right? So
Mhm.
manic stage has many, many disadvantages, but it also has the advantages of being creative again and very good mood, right? So it imitates exhilaration. And the second thing that's very cool about it is that even if I make you read negative text with sad events, right? But I make you read it faster and faster and faster and faster, as you go along the text, it still elevates your mood. I think this is probably, again, showing that the way you think trumps or it's more important than the content of your thought. One, and this is a little provocative hypothesis that I've been promoting, is that if you think FTP, if your thinking process is facilitated and progresses broadly and creatively and remotely and faster, then the content will follow suit and become positive because you go to different places, right? You are
Yeah.
out of this swamp and you went to see the sunrise somewhere, right, in this forest. So the idea here is that don't worry about the content. Don't try to replace a feeling of guilt or worthlessness or whatever with, oh, I have to think about my beautiful kids or the nice sunrise or whatever. No, don't worry about the content. Just think FTP and everything else will follow suit, as I said. Yeah.
That one sounds really similar to the DBT concept of opposite to emotion or sometimes opposite action. And kind of the foundation behind that idea is the idea of, this is my phrasing, but that depression and anxiety can function in like an almost parasitic kind of way. Because when you're in a really depressed state or in a really anxious state, it makes you function in a certain way, and it also makes you want to do certain things and not want to do certain things. And
Right.
if you follow your impulses and you follow your instincts when you're depressed, for example, typically the result of following through on those impulses and instincts is that you become more depressed because you're doing the things that your depression wants you to do. So it's almost, yeah, almost thinking of it like a separate entity. And so then the opposite is also true, meaning that if you sort of defy your depression and defy your anxiety and do the things that it doesn't want you to do or resist the urges to do the things that it wants you to do, you will typically become less depressed and less anxious. If you're depressed and your depression makes you want to just stay in bed all day, then at the end of the day, you look back and you say, I laid in bed all day. That's really depressing. My life sucks. I'm a loser. I feel even worse now. But if you can force yourself to do the opposite and do something that absolutely feels like the last thing on earth you want to do, it may not be an instant, like in the moment mood boost, but by the end
Right.
of the
Right.
day, you look back on your day and you say, you know what? I did some things today. I actually, and it gives you a little bit of trajectory, a little bit of positive momentum, and actually can be the start of what helps you break out of that episode. And so making your brain perform in a way that it's not wanting to perform seems like it's really aligned with that as well. And we know that helps
Exactly.
tremendously.
Yeah, yeah, exactly that.
Yeah. It's a weird way of using it, but I came across this concept of inversion thinking, which is actually it's a financial term. It's what certain agencies use in like investments, for example, where it's like, well, I don't know what to invest in. I can't figure out what the best investment is, but I think I could figure out what the worst investment is. So like if I wanted to lose all my money, I would invest in this. And then you try to figure out, oh, what's the most antithetical idea to the worst idea? And the most antithetical idea to the worst idea is probably a good idea. So if you think what would ruin my life and make my mental health terrible, that's often a way easier list to make than what do I think would help me right now. But if you start with that list and then go the opposite route, that's probably your list of what would help.
Right. And going back to your idea of changing mental habits, we didn't mention the brain much, but One of the
Right.
most encouraging things that people should know, and I sometimes talk to the general audience about the brain, and I find them becoming really optimistic about this, is that our brain is plastic. It changes through very late age. It's not like only kids can change their brain, right? So the idea here is that everything you learn, your brain and my brain will be different than what they were before this conversation even, right? So every new experience changes something in your brain. It's not like it changes it completely. It changes few connections, synapses, new networks. And that's another reason why it's so important to practice, because you're changing infrastructure. It's not like I play once and I come out really giddy and happy after this
Right.
session. It is amusing, it's a fun, but you need to practice because you create, or again recreate, pathways that have been lost during years of rumination and kind of non-FTP thinking. Yeah.
I'm glad
So
you mentioned time frame. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead. No.
I
What
was
were we
just gonna say,
saying?
I'm glad you brought up time frame too, because that's something I was hoping to bring up today. Is no one's saying that if you download and play Mood Bloom today, you're going to be out of a depressive episode by the end of the day.
Right.
Just as with any legitimate long-term beneficial treatment technique, it's going to take some time for this to show effects, right? And anything that makes you feel dramatically better the day that you do it usually is not a super healthy thing in the
Right.
long term. So um,
Exactly.
yeah, Mood Bloom and FTP is going to fall under a similar umbrella to like therapy and medication and physical activity, where these are going to be things that you notice more gradually over longer time frames, and
Exactly.
not
And
like an
even
instant, oh, today was such a good day because I did this new thing kind of feeling, right?
but you can even compare it not only with psychotherapy, but also with SSRIs like Prozac, right?
Right.
It doesn't
Yeah.
start, it's like it takes 3 or 4 weeks before it starts showing an effect, and then you have to stay on it. So the idea here is not like creating a new addiction. It's a new kind of training to you, because you're changing structure. You're not just changing, your the color of your shirt. You're changing structures in the brain, and for this you do take. But luckily, you don't have to work 3 hours a day at this.
Right.
Yeah.
And with neuroplasticity and cognitive flexibility too, like something I see, and I get where they're coming from. Something I see a lot of comments on my videos is like people saying, I feel like I'm just cursed with this brain that just doesn't work right, or that is
Sad.
so locked into these certain ways of functioning. And I simultaneously I empathize with those people a lot because I know what it's like to feel that way. And I also know, just again from my own personal walk, that that's absolutely not true. And I can still, I am still me. And when I, look at kind of how my brain works now compared to when I was 18 or whatever, there's still traces of the same thoughts and
Right.
patterns. But it's a very, as you said, like the changes on an everyday basis are minute. But when you add those changes up over long time frames, what you see is like you can have a pretty different brain in the future than the one you have now. And the things that negatively impact your mental health, your quality of life, about the way your brain functions today, don't necessarily have to be the way you are forever, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and it does resonate with what I said earlier about state of mind. Even the same Dr. Scott in the morning, in the afternoon, at night will be a somewhat different person, because there's a slide of how creative and non-creative, how happy or unhappy, how exploratory you are, how open you are to new experiences, right? So, and by the way, you mentioned your book, and I should get a hold of this. And I also would like to send you my book. It's called Mind Wandering, and I'll ask our secretary to send you a copy. And there I talk both about FTP at length. I mean, it's really about our tendency to mind wander, and it's not a book about depression, but it does touch on meditation, but also a lot on the state of mind and depression specifically. So yeah, it definitely echoes what you just said.
Yeah. No, I'd absolutely love that. And well, I'll definitely make sure you get a copy of mine as well. Get it
Yeah, yeah,
personalized for you.
I can also purchase it happily. So the last game, what was it? To
To
belong,
belong.
right?
That's yep.
Right. So that's another interesting concept. And again, I sometimes feel guilty to be fascinated by these topics, because there's human suffering behind it. You shouldn't be excited, but I'm excited about the science behind it. I have to admit, and I have to apologize if I sound happy when I talk about these ideas. we all recognize and we all familiar with family members or ourselves sometimes are inflicted with this. And it's a major problem and it's a complicated problem. And by the way, opening parenthesis here, when people ask us if this is replacing CBT or Prozac or whatever, it's like, this is such a complicated condition that we're not here to replace anybody. Like everybody could benefit from multiple approaches. Go for it. Go for a run. Play Mood Bloom. Go talk with your psychotherapist. Do meditation. Take SSRIs. Everything that helps you within the legitimate approaches. So we're not here to replace, but it really is. Okay, so the fascinating topic behind To Belong is that the knowledge that we have in our brain, right? The one I mentioned before about these networks is clustered. There's a reason for this, but we have these frames, we call it sometimes. You have, if I say, hey, Dr. Scott, think about a kitchen, right? So you'll immediately bring up maybe 20 objects that you know, or 10 objects that you know are certain to be in a kitchen, you know, a refrigerator, an oven, a stove, a coffee maker, sink, whatever, right? So we learn because it helps us a lot. It helps us retrieve information from memory. There's a reason behind the structuring of information. We can retrieve it easily. We can generate predictions, which is one major thing that the brain does. But the thing is that the more we believe these categories of things, the hardest the boundaries between them become, and we become more rigid in the way we think. I like to tell we have a term in the lab, we call it with my students, we call it a samurai sword in a kitchen, right? So if I tell you, would you expect a shoe in a kitchen? It's like, I don't expect it when you say, but you have kids, you know, you can find anything in a
Yeah,
kitchen. So
there have been
we,
shoes in our kitchen.
yes, exactly. So the boundaries of our categories are much softer. And the idea here is really to make you more able to transform and to accept things that seem non-conventional. No, we don't want to create anarchy here, but we want to create openness, right? The idea here is that you can expect things that are less likely but possible. So if I show you a picture of a school bus on a road, of course you would expect a traffic light. I say, okay, it's a road. But then, do you expect a dolphin? No, dolphin is really hard for me to expect here. Do you expect a backpack? It's like, okay, backpack is conceivable, right? So kind of flexing, again, this word flexing, because cognitive flexibility is behind FTP, really. So we want people to be able to accept things that they didn't expect, but they can live with. They can see how it can, and gradually softening these boundaries of categories and make you more able to shift between contexts, just like we've shown and others have shown that what we call task switching, the ability to switch between different tasks increases with better mood. So if you do three things in parallel, you might not be productive, but it can improve your mood. If you're easier changing, even playing with your kids, three different games at the same time. So you there's a set of rules here, there's a set of rules here, there's a set of rules there. Switching between them rapidly improves your mood. So the same way here with categories and representation, if I flex what belongs where, it gives rise to improvement in mood. So that's what behind To Belong.
I just want to say I completely relate to your feelings of excitement on better understanding like mental illness, for example. And I also relate to the the guilt you sometimes feel around that. I totally get it. That's me often in a first session with somebody who will come in and they're saying, they might say something like, I experience this like just hollow, empty feeling inside of me sometimes, and I don't know what the heck it is, and I just don't enjoy anything in my life. And like, I think I sometimes start to smile when people say that, not because I'm happy that they're suffering, but because I'm like, I'm about to be able to tell you what's happening. You,
Exactly.
however many years old you are, you've been living with this for so long, not knowing what it is, not having a name for it, not having a path forward, and I'm going to be able to help you figure that out. And that's the exciting part to me. I'm not happy that you're suffering. I'm happy that we're going to be able to figure this out together.
Yeah. Well, this happened to me exactly with my GP recently. I came to him with a pain in my stomach, and I said, I've been
Yeah.
suffering for 3 weeks, and it's really exactly here. So he smiled, he really grinned and stepped up and said,
Yeah.
I'm going to tell you exactly what you have. And he was so happy. Like, why are you happy? But yes, exactly that. Yes.
Yeah, and it's just one last thought for me is, what you said about Mood Bloom and FTP being, probably a part of or like one tool in someone's tool belt, right? And that's for anyone experiencing, especially like moderate to severe symptoms. I think in nearly 100% of those cases, a person's, solution, so to speak, is almost always going to be multifactorial. There's probably not going to be any one thing, one treatment technique, one medication, one habit that's just going to eradicate your symptoms. Sometimes when
Right.
people experience mild symptoms, they do find that magic bullet, right? Where it's like this one thing
Right.
really was all I needed. And I think that's where I see memes, on Instagram of like, I don't need therapy, I have the gym. Okay, that works for some people. I think for
Whatever
most
floats
people,
your
the
boat.
the
Yeah.
yeah, I think, for me, I value the gym incredibly, and the gym has been a huge part of my journey, but it wasn't the answer. And I tend to think like, why don't we just do all of the things? If there's five, six, seven different things that might help, rather than just getting super locked into one and saying, okay, this is going to be my answer, forget everything else, I'm going to do this. Each of them will have a cumulative effect on your mental health. And the
Okay.
more things you can stack in your
Uh-huh.
favor, the more likely you are to reach that endpoint you're trying to get to. And this could be one thing in a person's stack, right? Maybe on top of therapy, on top of medications, on top of the gym, on top of having a good social life. The more things you stack, the higher a place you can reach mental health wise and functioning wise. And that's the end game, right? That's the goal we're all trying to get
Exactly.
to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree with you. Yeah.
Well, we're about out of time today. Any other last thoughts you'd want to put out there before we call it a day?
Well, I can maybe share just it's not technical, but something about the future. So, we're a
Sure.
new company. We're a new company. We did show marvelous results, and I'm not a marketing person, but the results in our clinical trials at Mass General Hospital were staggering, and many people are excited about it, professional psychiatrists and as well as potential partners. But somebody like me who is both with ADHD and is being, well, not both, because of my ADHD, maybe being, no, right. Both because I'm ADHD and being and bored easily, but also because I'm not playing. I usually don't play games. The last game I played was Space Invaders, in the
Yeah.
90s or whatever, 80s.
That's a great
So,
game, though.
yeah, it is a great game. Uh, I do want to reassure people that it is our vision to have a library of such TGs. The game Mood Bloom is not five little circles, play with them to death, or no, ad nauseum, and then just this is it for you. But rather, we're currently working on two new games. There are other two new games in the pipeline. There will always be, but all these games will adhere to these principles of FTP, like how can you make the association, like the chains game that you mentioned. It will be a different form that achieves the same thing. So different ways of getting at the same effect. Yeah.
Sure.
But otherwise, I really appreciate your interest and your contribution overall, not only to Moodbloom, but also I like that you clicked with Moodbloom, but all your other activities as well. So I really appreciate the opportunity to speak.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks for taking the time to meet with me today. I realized I didn't really introduce you at all. I just launched into talking because I was so excited. So I'll
We had
I'll add a
technical,
little introduction. I'll splice in a little introduction at the beginning so that it doesn't seem like people just got dropped into the middle of a conversation, which they kind of did since we started on Google Meets, but that's a whole other thing. Thank you so much for taking the time to meet with me today. I think it's evening where you are, right? You're probably about
yeah,
getting ready
I'm
for
going to
bed,
the
right?
gym now. I'm going to the gym right now. It's 9
Oh, there you
p.m.
go. All right. Well, thanks
Okay.
so much for your time. Have a good workout, and I'll probably talk to you soon. All right.
Take care. Bye bye. Thank you, Dr.
Take
Scott.
care,
Bye.
Professor.
Bye.
Bye.